We have two speakers tonight. The second will be Dr. Richard M. Leventhal, Executive Director of the Penn Cultural Heritage Center of the Penn Museum and Professor in Penn's Department of Anthropology. He is a curator in the museum's American section and formerly served here as the Williams Director. Prior to coming to Penn, he was the president of the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and the director of the Cotson Institute of Archaeology at UCLA. He is one of the directors of the Tihosuco Heritage Preservation and Community Development Project, focused upon the 19th century Caste War rebellion in the Yucatan. He has written extensively about the ancient Maya and about cultural heritage preservation. Our first speaker, however, is Ms. Cristina Coc, a Quechua Mayan community leader in southern Belize, who founded and is presently program director of the Julian Cho Society. Ms. Coc brings a wealth of knowledge of these communities, fluency in Quechua, and experience in mobilizing local residents. I think it will give you some idea of her credentials to talk about this if I give you some extracts from her bio. Upon completion of her degree, Coc returned to her home, a traditional Mayan village in the Toledo district of Belize. And in 2005, Coc founded the Julian Cho Society, named for a former Maya activist, which is dedicated to the conservation of environments and rights of indigenous peoples of southern Belize. In 2006, Coc served as spokesperson, organizer, and witness in a landmark case involving Maya land rights, presenting testimony on the customary land tenure of the Maya and the history and ethnography of the region. Coc and fellow Maya advocate Greg Chuk urged that the traditional boundaries and land tenure of southern Belize be respected, and that the government cease granting logging and mineral extraction rights on Maya lands. In October 2007, the Toledo Maya won their case. The government was ordered to protect the traditional boundaries and land tenure of southern Belize. The case also required that discussion of land management in the Mayan communities must involve the communities and that their human rights must be protected by the government. After repeated court action in 2015, the Caribbean Court of Justice upheld the land rights of the Maya, ordering the government of Belize to protect their rights and pay reparations. Within a few months of the verdict, Coc was arrested along with other members of the Maya Leadership Alliance and accused of unlawfully detaining Rupert Miles, a non-Mayan who was building a house on sacred land. The incident escalated to international levels, with the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples calling on the government of Belize to establish a dialogue with Maya leadership and resolve the case, as well as land tenure issues of Belize's Maya people. In December 2015, the charges of unlawful imprisonment were dropped, and in June 2016, the prosecution of the remainder of the charges was halted. Coc continues in her fight to enforce the land tenure rights the Maya people won in their landmark judgment, and has returned to the Caribbean Court of Justice to enlist their help in monitoring the government of Belize's compliance. In 2015, Coc and other members of the Maya Leaders Alliance were awarded the Equator Prize for their advocacy on Indigenous rights. So it's a really great pleasure now to hand over to Cristina Coc for Maya, Land, Identity, and Human Rights. Cristina.
Thank you kindly for that invitation and that introduction, Steve. I'm very happy to join this Archaeology and Action lecture series. Good evening to everybody. What I was asked to speak about is to elaborate on the theme of Maya land, what it means to the Maya people, our identity, and how it relates to our human rights. And so, if the time permits, I will summarize what is, you can go to the next slide, Richard. What is a 3-decade-long struggle of the Maya people. I think we skipped a slide.
The Maya land rights struggle in southern Belize. This involves both the Quechua and the Mopan Maya here in the Toledo district, the district I was born in, the district I was raised. And so this is, not a recent struggle. It's been about 3 decades that we've been struggling for our rights to our land. And there have been many leaders before myself and the leaders presently who have been a part of this land rights movement. And it really is, started way before the 1990s with the Toledo Indian movement, and then in the 90s, led by the Toledo Maya Cultural Council, and present day being led by the Toledo Alcaldes Association, the Maya Leaders Alliance, and the Julian Trust Society. And so what I am going to talk to you about is not to go necessarily in depth with the Maya land rights struggle, but to make the connection between land, Mayan identity or Mayan self-determination, and fundamental human rights of Indigenous peoples. And so if you could go to the next slide, I will summarize the background of what led to the Maya land rights struggle. As is the case with many indigenous peoples all around the world, a lot of times, indigenous peoples are living peacefully on their land until there is an incursion or there is an interest in the lands that indigenous peoples live on. In our case, we, prior to the 1990s, we were mostly considered the forgotten district, where not much was going on, not much development, not much interest. We're pretty much isolated Maya communities in southern Belize. There was one dirt road that led all the way to Toledo, and that was, rarely traversed by the rest of the country. And so post 1990, we saw a resurgence or an interest from multinational companies, and in particular from a company called Atlantic Industries Limited, a Malaysian logging company, who was granted concession to log about a great deal of the Toledo district. I want to say about 90% of the Toledo district. And what that meant was that this would touch and impact the lives of all the Maya people who were living in more than 39 Maya villages in the Toledo district. And so in 1993, when these logging concessions were granted, the Maya communities began to organize themselves and began to raise questions and concerns with the government of Belize over these concessions, primarily because they were not aware of them, they were not consulted about them, but most importantly, because it would have a direct livelihood impact. And so the government of Belize at that time basically took the position that the Maya communities do not need to be consulted, that those are crown lands, national lands, and the government has the freedom basically to grant these permits and these concessions on these lands. And so that led then the leaders of the Maya movement at that time to file a case before the Belize Supreme Court. Unfortunately, in the mid-1990s, the court did not bring this matter to a hearing, and so that case languished. What that led to was, of course, the villages trying to negotiate an amicable resolution with the government of Belize through friendly negotiations, through lobbying efforts, through protests, raising awareness both nationally and internationally around these cases, but most of which fell on deaf ear. So that by 1998, they filed a petition to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, hoping to draw international attention to this evolving incursions on their land and these violations, a lot of which was a violation to the right to life and livelihoods, the right to justice in this case, because they were not able to bring it before a domestic court to seek relief, but also the right to equality, because the Maya people felt that for the most part, their lack of inclusion or not being consulted was in fact discriminatory, and to not recognize that they were already using and occupying that land and that there was a direct tie to their life, it resulted in what we would describe as discrimination against Maya communities. So in 1998 is when they filed that petition. Shortly after that, there was a general elections in Belize. And so that then led to some opening of further friendly negotiations with the new administration in power. That led to the historic signing of the 10 points of agreement. And in that 10 points of agreement, really the government recognized that Maya people have a right to their customary lands in southern Belize. Nevertheless, that's not where the story ends. Unfortunately, those agreements were never fulfilled by the government. And then this led to then what resulted in a series of strategic litigation. If you could go to the next slide. Do you want to go to the next slide, Richard? So what resulted, given that the government failed on its commitment under the 2010 points agreement between the Maya people and the government of Belize, the Maya people began to organize themselves and began to continue their defense for their land. The Inter-American Commission's petition that I spoke about, which was filed in 1998, did not produce a result until 2004. And you will see then in this slide a series of unbroken decisions, favorable decisions for the Maya communities. And you will see that in 2004 was when we received the Inter-American Commission's recommendations. And basically what the Inter-American Commission recognized was that the rights of the Maya people to their lands and resources was being violated, and that the government should take measures to recognize and respect the long-standing use and occupancy of those lands by the Maya people, and that they should clearly define, delimit the territories of the Maya people, and that they should provide redress for the ongoing violations and put an end to future violations. And so that was the first favorable decision with regard to the Maya land rights movement. However, the government's response to that was really that the Inter-American Commission could not enforce. In fact, to date, they have not really publicly recognized that they have lost that case before the Inter-American Commission, which then led the Maya people to continue to defend their land, to continue to organize, to continue to build their capacity. And they took a decision in 2007, early 2007, to go back to the domestic courts and to seek redress for these ongoing violations. By this time, we were now not only faced with logging concessions, but we were faced with oil development concessions to explore for oil in southern Belize, along with, of course, land sales, land grants that were creating direct impact on our lives. And so in 2007, two villages, Santa Cruz and Conejo, decided to go before the Supreme Court of Belize to ask a question to the court to determine who owns these lands in southern Belize. If it was in fact true, by the government's definition, that the Maya people were simply squatting on these lands, that we were merely squatters, or that, as we felt, we were owners and occupiers of this land by virtue of our long-standing use and occupancy on these lands. And so very shortly thereafter, in 2007, that came about the first historic decision in favor of the Maya people, as you heard earlier. However, the response of the government at that time was to limit that decision to just those two model communities. The government took the position that if we wanted the same kind of affirmation, if we wanted the same kind of protection, we would have to come back before the courts now with all the remainder Maya communities. And so then that led to a return to the Supreme Court in about 2008. The case took a little bit longer and we were not able to get a decision until 2010. Here again, the Supreme Court recognized and affirmed the rights of Maya people to their ancestral lands and territories, and affirmed that by virtue of having those rights, that the government had an obligation to clearly define, delimit the territories, and to put a mechanism in place whether that be legislative or otherwise, to protect those rights. It also imposed an injunction on the government to cease and desist from further granting any development concessions that might affect the use and enjoyment of our lands as Maya people. And so that was a very momentous time for the Maya movement. It certainly was a historic win, not just for Maya people in southern Belize, but for Indigenous peoples regionally and internationally. Unfortunately, at that time, the government decided that they would appeal that case. We went before the Court of Appeals between 2010 and 2013. In 2013, again, the Belize Court of Appeals ruled in favor of the Maya people. This case was further appealed to the highest appellate court, which was the Caribbean Court of Justice, and that decision was not handed down until April of 2015. In the final decision, the government of Belize was ordered by way of a consent order, so we came to an agreement in front of the court that the Maya people, by virtue of their long-standing use and occupation of our traditional lands, that we have a right to these lands, and that right is equal, if not the same, as the kind of property rights that are afforded to all Belizeans under the Constitution of Belize in Belize. And so the court upheld the ruling and the judgment of the lower courts, the Supreme Court, which ordered the government of Belize, as I mentioned earlier, to clearly define delimited territory and to put legislative mechanisms in place to protect the rights of the Maya Erchi and the Mopan in Toledo. It also continued to impose a cease and desist on the government from any further granting of development concessions, logging, oil exploration, land sales, land grabs, where it might affect the use and enjoyment of our lands. And so this sort of summarizes for you how the Maya people have been defending their right to land. And so now if you could go to the next slide. While all of that is important, what I would like to draw your attention to is I guess the varied definitions of land, land as Maya heritage, and what land means to others. From what we can perceive, land is often associated with power for the outside. Land is often associated with wealth. Land is often seen as real estate or seen for the valuable resources on the land. And in the case of Belize, certainly seen for political capital. There was a time in the history of Toledo where whenever there was a general elections coming up, our parliamentarians, our ministers of government would offer land in exchange for votes. Today, in the history of Belize, there's only one part of Belize that this practice no longer continues, and that is in southern Belize. Because for the Maya, contrary to what is associated with land from the outside, for us Maya people, the land is our identity. It defines our entire way of life. It defines our language. It defines our culture. Land is where we practice our spirituality. It certainly is viewed as our heritage. And in summary, we'll see the contrast between then how we perceive land versus how others perceive land. And I have put here on the slide 4 words that I'd like to share with you in my language. In the Mayan culture, we refer to ourselves, particularly in Erchi, we say, we are we are children of Mother Earth. And that speaks volumes to how we associate our identity, our language, when we describe the land. If you think about Sutaka in my highest mountains to the valleys, and describes the entire spectrum of space that we find ourselves and identify ourselves with. When we talk about land as a part of our heritage, we say that the land is the land of Kasheton. It is the land of our ancestors. It is the land of our roots. In my language, She means roots. And so when we talk about land, then you will often hear us describe it as the land is Katuam. It is our life. And so what I want to draw your attention to then is that the struggle, the entire struggle, regardless of the medium through which we have defended our land, and in this case, through strategic litigation, we have been fighting then for a right to self-determination. If you could go to the next slide. This has been a people's struggle for self-determination. A lot of times it is confused and misunderstood to be a struggle for land rights. While that is true, what is the real message is that Maya people have been struggling for a right to their well-being, for a right to define their entire existence, for a right to be able to determine how it is that they want to live, how it is that they want to be Maya. And this struggle then has been against powerful governments who want to maintain control over the land so that they can distribute those lands to whomever they choose. And so that they do that in their interest as a government. We have been struggling also against corporations who, like I described earlier, take an interest in the wealth of resources that are on our traditional lands. Oil development, logging development, all these major corporations that take an interest in our lands. We have been struggling against foreign investors who find real estate costs lower in third world countries like Belize, and who are taking over some of the prime lands in Belize. We struggle against land speculators, real estate agents. But to understand then that struggle of the Maya people, it's really to see the struggle as a struggle to preserve our ways of knowing and our ways of being. In other words, a struggle for a Maya way of life. If you could go to the next slide. Now I want to try to bring the link now with how the Maya land rights is connected to archaeology. When we went before the courts, unfortunately, we were made to provide evidence of our claims, of our land claims. And we relied heavily on historical accounts, anthropological accounts and data to evidence our long-standing occupation and use of land. And as you know, historical accounts and archaeological accounts bear witness to Indigenous ancestry. It talks about the origins of our people and the proof of our indigeneity. But there's a real problem with that. And the problem is that the story of our past is often told by foreigners from an outside perspective. And so it's important, and we continue to believe that it's very important that our relationship to the land and our cosmovision as Indigenous people, as Maya people, that this has to be articulated by our own accounts, by our lived experience and the testimonies of our elders and our knowledge holders. And so archaeology plays a central role in defining Indigenous identity, in defining Indigenous people's link to their land, and in influencing how Indigenous people's rights and how Indigenous people's human rights in particular are addressed within nation states. And so this is why it is critical that when we think about the archaeological data, when we think about anthropological data, historical data, it's important that Indigenous peoples themselves are involved in telling and providing those kinds of testimonies and providing those kinds of evidence. If we could go to the next slide. So where are we at today? Well, as I mentioned earlier, recognized through the highest courts of the region and now internationally, the rights of the Maya people have been affirmed, the rights to their lands. They can enjoy the use of their lands and the occupation of their lands. We have established that there is protection of our land rights under the Constitution of Belize, and that's equal to other protections to land that is afforded to other Belizeans under the same constitution. There is an obligation on the state to clearly delimit and demarcate and then provide title to these lands to the Maya people and to abstain from any further interference with our lands. This is the order and judgment of the highest court of the land. It's been 8 years since that decision was handed down, and we are still trying to implement this decision in good faith with the government. Unfortunately, we continue to see numerous delays in the implementation of this recognition and these recognized rights. Nevertheless, the Maya people have been engaged in the process of mapping their territory. They have been engaged in the process of negotiating free, prior, and informed consent protocols to establish how it is that corporations or other interests, outside interests on Maya lands might engage with the Maya people. We've also been involved in developing and addressing the issue of a Maya economy, ensuring that the issue of economic challenges are addressed within our lands, looking at opportunities to build a Maya economy through Indigenous innovations, through community aspirations over how to use the resources on their lands in a sustainable way and in a way that honors their values, their traditions. And so these are some of the ongoing activities and projects of the Maya people as we continue to advance the defense of our rights to our land. The next slide, please. Can we move to the next slide?
Cristina, can you hear me?
Richard, I can hear you.
Okay, but can Cristina finish up? This is her slide, and I don't know if she's
Might be
there.
having some technical. Oh, here she is.
Hi, I'm sorry about that. I don't know how far along I was before I got cut off.
You just started on on this slide, community museums.
Okay, so now to tie it all with where we are in terms of why we are pursuing community museums. As I told you earlier, we relied heavily on the data of anthropological accounts of the Maya and their historical accounts of presence on these lands in the past. But a lot of times what we came across was that there's a clear disconnect between the Mayas of the ancient past and their descendant communities. One of the biggest arguments that the government continues to used in the litigation, but also continues to use as a narrative in Belize, is that the Maya people that are present in these villages in the Toledo district are in fact recent migrants from Guatemala and neighboring countries. So there's a real disconnect between the ancient Mayas, our ancestors, and the descendant Mayas, the present day Mayas. And so we thought that it was very important to begin to focus our energy on articulating our own identity, our own heritage, and developing our own way, the way that we want to be represented. And so this led then to discussions and eventual projects to implement in Laguna Village, one of our Maya villages, to develop a community museum. And a lot of times we often think when people in Belize around the world think about museums, we often think about the ancient artifacts, or we think about trying to represent a time of the past. And so we recognize that colonialization was very good about writing us in the past, writing our history as if it is a civilization that has gone. And as you know, the accounts of the Maya civilization is that it collapsed. And so we see that as a continuation of the erasure of indigenous identities, an erasure of the existence of descendant communities, and a denial altogether of our rights as Maya people, although we continue to live and thrive within the rainforests that remain in southern Belize. And so this led us then to the important discussion around community museums and how we might want to represent who we are, our identity as Indigenous people in Toledo. The next slide. That summarizes sort of what I have prepared to share with you. I'm very interested in your questions because I think that will then help me to address some of your areas of interest that you might want me to elaborate on. I want to thank you for your time, and I also want to thank you again, Richard, and all of you for inviting me to the Archaeology and Action lecture series. I've just posted on my last slide here a link if you wanted to see more, learn more about the Maya land rights movement. But with that, I want to say thank you.
Great. Let me just start my video and share screen, which will be, oh, great. Hold on just a second, I apologize. Here we go. That should work. Where is my? No, I'm not able to share just for a moment. Hold on a second. There we go. And I need to play this.
Richard, we just have a white screen.
You just have a white screen? Okay, great. I don't, let me see what I can do. Let me try to, I apologize. There, hold on, it seems to be working now. How's that? Oh, what the hell? Okay, so I'm having now trouble. So let me try something else. Close this up. Okay. Technology is not in a good mood tonight. I do not know why. Okay. Tina or Kevin, you're going to need to help me here.
Okay, what we can do is go ahead and get started and I'll try to download your slides and bump in when we can.
Okay, let me just
that
try
okay?
one more thing. Yeah, hold on a
You may
second.
have to go in system pressings.
Oh, I see. Hold on.
Thank you for your patience, everyone.
Yeah, I apologize. It wants me to leave the seminar and I don't want to do that.
You might have to do it and come back.
Okay, let
it
me
might have to do
me,
with the recording.
okay.
But if you'd like to begin, I will try to get your slides downloaded and bring them up as soon as possible.
Okay, let me start and then if you could, because I'm having a hard time. So
Yep.
Thank you very much. And I apologize for the technology glitches. Cristina, thank you very much for your presentation. I just want to say I've been working with Cristina now for probably over 30 years, maybe 35 years, and thinking about exactly what she was talking about, which is one of the stories that we have talked about in terms of both the ancient Maya and how that connects directly to the modern Maya. And one of the things that I think both Cristina and I, along with other leaders of the Maya in southern Belize, are focused on this idea that we do need to begin to change the construct of how we tell stories about both the ancient Maya, but also how that ancient Maya connects to the modern Maya people. So right now, we started a project in Toledo with Cristina and her colleagues on a community museum in Laguna Village, and that is moving forward. There we go. So if you could, yes. So let me just start right there, Tina. Can you share that or do a full screen?
I am sharing. You should see it.
Okay,
full.
that's great. Okay, so I just want to start out, go back and start talking about connecting this to what Cristina was saying. There are two common storylines, both in the United States, in Mexico, Belize, United States, about the Maya. The first one is that if you're thinking and studying about the Maya, you're thinking about the ancient Maya. You're not thinking about people who are living today. And the second one, as Cristina said, is that the Maya society collapsed. And the story that is told to tourists is that Maya people have disappeared. Next slide, please. And in fact, what's fascinating is if you go to places like Cancun or even in Belize, oftentimes in hotels, the people who are serving the tourists, the people who are there presenting their culture, are not perceived to be Maya people. Maya people don't exist. And so in some sense, this lack of history that Cristina was talking about, we see over and over again, even though there are Maya people who are building the hotels in Cancun, who are building the hotels in Caye Caulker, Ambergris Caye, and Belize, and other places. Next slide, please. I think this is a map very illustrative of what we're talking about. Here is a map produced in Belize of southern Belize, and it's got jaguars and natural trees and fish, and it has the portrait of a Maya woman. This is, again, I think, the way the story is told about who Maya people are as perceived on the landscape of Belize. And I think this follows up very much what Cristina was saying. Next slide, please. So in southern Belize is an archaeological site called Nimli Punit, has some beautiful carvings, as you can see here. Next slide. It's a very large place with the ball courts, beautiful rainforest around it. Next slide, please. And in fact, it is seen as a major tourist attraction for Norwegian cruise lines that runs tours just north of the region in Belize, and then buses people to Nimli Punit. But what is found there is that nobody in the villages in southern Belize gain any economic benefits from these tourists coming to the ancient Maya sites. The buses, the food, everything that's tied to tourism is paid to non-Maya people for all of those resources. And the only thing the Maya are able to do is sell trinkets, as you can see in the right-hand photograph, to people who are visiting a place like Nimli Punit. Next slide, please. And so what we began to think about is not only to think about how to benefit from this both economically and culturally, but also to think, as Cristina was talking about, how to begin to work with Maya communities to have them tell their own story and not to have it run through people like me. I am an outsider. I am not a Belizean. I have worked in Belize for 40 or 50 years, but that still doesn't make me a Belizean. And so what we have done is we've been able to get resources here at Penn with a large grant from the Mellon Foundation. And part of that grant is going to the development of community museums, both here in Laguna as well as in Mexico. And here you can see a photograph of the community, the committee for the community museum in Laguna, as well as the way Laguna represented itself in 1997. Next slide, please. But again, this is one of the meetings that we have had. It's a meeting outside in Laguna. But I wanted to put up something that we wrote on. We're not using whiteboards, we're using paper, but it was focused on this idea of the mission. We want to remember who we are. This is what the people of Laguna were saying, and that the words that were used about who we are was culture, traditions, and stories. And these were the critical elements of what the community museum is focused upon. And we are working towards the creation of this museum. It should happen probably within about a year. We've just been identifying locations, identifying aspects that we want to highlight within the museum. But I'm only the convener. I am not the person writing, developing, or creating this museum. It's the people of Laguna. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to put this up. This is Cristina, you can see there on the right-hand side, along with Pablo Mies and Filiberto Panalos. These are people who are the leaders of the Maya movement in Toledo, in this Toledo district of Belize. Next slide, please. And one of the things I just want to mention, I think one of the most interesting events that I've been to in a long time occurred just before the pandemic. It was in October of 2019. And this is when the Maya communities of southern Belize created a conference called an Abink. It was a gathering of Maya traditional knowledge holders and academics. And it was basically to say, come down and stop going to your professional meetings, come to a meeting here in Belize and tell us what you've been doing. Tell us why you've been doing it, how you've been doing it, and how it's going to benefit Maya people. And so I know that I certainly left in the middle of Thursday, flew down, got there, missed a little bit of the conference, but was able to present, as you can see there. And on the bottom right is the group of people at that conference in 2019. I think it's, again, it was about Maya rights, saying, if you're going to study Maya people and you're studying who we are, we want to talk to you about that information. Next slide, please. I also want to just quickly jump over to Mexico in a place called Tihosuco. And Tihosuco was the center of one of the largest indigenous rebellions in the New World. It occurred in the 19th century, in 1847, when the Maya people of the region, starting in Tihosuco, rebelled against the country of Mexico. And they almost won and almost created their own country in this late part of the 19th century. On the left is the church in Tihosuco. It's been renovated, but at the end of it has been left open. And as the people of Tihosuco talk about it, it's to remind people of the blood that was spilled during this rebellion. And on the right-hand side is a sculpture of not an ancient Maya person, but in fact of a Maya leader who led this rebellion, Jacinto Pat. Next slide, please. And so what I want to talk about is just the idea that, in fact, not only in southern Belize, we're working with the communities to think about how Maya people tell their story, but also here in Tihosuco. And in fact, if you look on the mural on the right-hand side, what that says is the Maya zone is not an ethnographic museum, it's a community moving forward. And I think this is the way Maya people begin to see this region rather than just as part of the past. Go ahead, go on to the next slide. And this is the area that was in contention back in the 19th century, and in fact remains in contention today. The area south of Cancun, between Tulum, a place called Santa Cruz, and Chichen Itza, this is a region where rebellion still occurs today, and where people are still fighting against the government of Mexico. Next slide. And so, in fact, the Caste War occurred between 1847 and 1901. It was one of the largest rebellions. Tens of thousands of people were killed. Hundreds of thousands of people were displaced. Eventually, around 1900, the Mexican military was brought in, as you can see on the bottom right, in massive numbers. And eventually, the Maya were brought to the peace table and signed the treaty. However, next slide, please. In many respects, the Zapatista revolution that occurred in 1994 in Chiapas in Mexico is perceived to be a continuation of this caste war, of the rebellion against Mexico. And so even though the official end of the war was in 1901, in many respects, this region remained very contentious in Mexico, and the Zapatista revolution, which started in 1994, continues today in 2023. Next slide, please. And so here is part of this is a state museum, but in this part of the museum are artifacts that were gathered by people of Tihosuco, identifying stuff that was simply of interest to themselves, not of interest to the government, not of interest to archaeologists. Some of these are objects made recently. Some of these are metal objects found in the fields. This is stuff that simply people find interesting and find important. Again, beginning to tell their own story of what is heritage as they perceive it. Next slide, please. And in fact, for the first year and a half, 2 years of my visiting this region, I was not shown any of the ruins, any of the material associated with the rebellion from the 19th century. And in fact, the town of Tihosuco was protecting upwards of 10 abandoned haciendas, abandoned towns, and other abandoned ranches. And again, they were protecting it because they felt it was part of their own heritage. And it took a couple of years to gain the confidence of the community. And then one day I was taken there by Eladio Mopat on the left, Carlos Chan Espinosa, and Freddie Balam on the right, is taken out to several of the sites. Next slide, please. That include places like this called Shulam Beach. This was the hacienda, this is the house of Jacinto Paz, the leader of the rebellion against the government of Mexico. This is sacred heritage for the community of Tihosuco, and in fact, of Maya people from the region in the Yucatan. Next slide, please. And here is Jacinto Paz. We do not have a photograph of him. We have a modern day painting / drawing of him, and we have a statue. But here he is shown on the right-hand side wearing the symbol of Maya leadership against this caste war, a golden earring in his left ear. And there he is as a statue holding his machete, where he was apparently a very great warrior, would take his machete, and there you can see that it's been painted to show it's been sharpened and ready to go off to battle again. Next slide, please. But abandoned out in the jungle is an active church, and here it is. This is a church that is still sacred territory. The altar is still preserved, and people still come out to this church to pray, to keep it clean, and to respect part of the past that is tied to this rebellion. This was built back in the 18th and 19th centuries, and then abandoned about 1847, 1850. Next slide, please. And gradually they are talking more and more in the museum within Tihosuco about the leaders of the caste war as part of the heritage of who they are. Next slide. And so, in fact, we have started a project on the preservation of heritage for the development of Tihosuco, similar to a project that we've started in Laguna, as I talked about. This is a project in Tihosuco, slightly larger because it involves both archaeology and a whole range of other activities. Next slide. And here are the list of activities that include archaeological work, oral histories, research and archives, preservation and development of a museum, looking at awareness of what are colonial houses from this 19th century, preservation, revitalization of the Maya language. And many of these projects are, in fact, were identified by the community, not just by us. We sit down every year and discuss what we are going to do and how we are going to develop the project on an annual basis. And this is a project from the socialized land organization called the Ejido of Tihosuco, the City Hall of Tihosuco, the Museum of the Caste War, and the Penn Cultural Heritage Center here at the University of Pennsylvania. Next slide, please. This is just a quick slide to show you some of the a map of some of the abandoned haciendas, some of the roads that we have found that connected these haciendas in the 19th century. It's a very complex and difficult area to work in, dense jungle overgrowth, but we've done an awful lot of work over the last 8 to 10 years. Next slide. Including some excavations, as you can see in the top left, including uncovering in the bottom left that site of Shkulim Peach, the house of Jacinto Pat, and having a conversation about what we're seeing there. These were the steps leading up into the house, but also there were cattle that were there and water tanks for the cattle. And we have to map it and understand when these were developed over periods of time. On the bottom right, we're sitting, in fact, in that abandoned church where I am being told stories of how important that church is. Next slide, please. In the town of Tihosuco, there are houses and what are called casas coloniales, colonial houses that were built in the 19th century that were abandoned and that people are beginning to reoccupy, but most of them don't have the money to rebuild it, and it is against the law to destroy these buildings. So many of them, as the woman standing in front of her house, she actually has a thatched building inside that stone house from the 19th century. Next slide, please. And in fact, also people are talking about how do we photograph, how do we work with the community in terms of representing who they are. And this is a family that wanted their photograph taken in front of Jacinto Pat because he is a hero for this town and for the people living in the town. And again, it's the story not about the ancient Maya, but about the modern Maya and the rebellion against Mexico. Next slide. We're also collecting photographs from the community and publishing them on an annual basis. On the right-hand side is just one of them from 2018. We've done 4 more. And on the left-hand side is, in fact, drawings of the story of the rebellion, of the heroes of the rebellion, both in Spanish and in Yucatec Maya. So this is about language preservation and revitalization. Next slide, please. And in fact, the story of Jacinto Pat is told over and over again. And this is just one from 2012 when it was told. And it doesn't go in direct order from left to right. It is a circular pattern where the history is in fact much more complicated than the way that they are presented. Next slide, please. And in fact, here at the end of a day, some of the archaeological work, they are walking on one of the roads from the 19th century, having mapped it and having begun to put together the history of this town of Tihosuco. But again, it's the history of Tihosuco as defined by the people who live there. Next slide. And this is also part of the whole process of working with the community and presenting the information about that we gather. All of the information stays there. We make copies in order to take them out of Mexico. And we are constantly in the process of working with the community to make sure that the information is understood and presented within the community, as well as presented during the festival, which relates to specifically to the development of the stories of the rebellion against the government of Mexico, the Caste War from 1847. Next slide, please. And that is basically two projects that I think play off very much of what Cristina was talking about from the first half of the talk. This is what we're trying to do, is to understand the nature of how stories get told, and that we just can't be outsiders telling stories about both the ancient Maya and modern Maya. Maya people themselves have to begin to tell these stories, and we are trying to work with these communities both in southern Belize and in Mexico to move this forward. Thank you very much. So I think there's time for questions.
Thank you so much, Richard and Cristina. There are a few questions in the chat, and I can read them out to you. Cristina, you were talking about migrants. Are the migrants you were talking about, to which you referred, are they Mayan people coming from other countries?
Yes. That's the narrative that has been the narrative. First, the government of Belize basically said that we were the descendant Maya communities of the ancient Mayas that used to occupy these lands, but that in fact we were recent migrants from Guatemala in particular. And as you know, there is a standing dispute between Belize and Guatemala, and so that does not bode well for the solidarity that Maya people enjoy from the rest of ordinary Belizeans. Today, the narrative you will find interesting is that now that we have a recognition of our rights to the land, now that the government is mandated to clearly define the limited territory, that in fact we are grabbing or we're expanding our land claims, and that we are inviting our Guatemalan relatives over to enjoy these same rights. So now that's the newest and latest narrative. But what you will see in all this narrative, and the point that I was getting at, is that it's a continued attempt to deny the recognition of our existence as the descendant community of the Maya people who once occupied all of this space before there were national borders, before there was a Mexico, before there was a Guatemala. You know, this was the land that we occupied, and our indigeneity then is tied to this region, to this area. Thank you.
Thank you. Richard, you expanded on this a little bit already in your lecture, but are there plans to expand this model of community museums into Guatemala as well?
I think the answer is yes, eventually. I think right now we were able to get money through this Penn Mellon project to begin the process of developing a museum in southern Belize, which is moving forward very well. And we hope in Tihosuco, and literally we're having day-to-day conversations about that. I think the eventuality we would think that the ideas need to expand to other parts of Belize, other parts of Mexico, and obviously into places like Guatemala and Honduras. It really does, however, require that, again, outsiders like me begin to take a back seat to local communities that want to tell their story and how they want to tell that story. So I have no immediate plans. I'm just trying to work on these two projects at the moment, which is keeping me rather busy as it is.
Thank you. And you just mentioned the areas in which would be, the land of the Maya, but could you repeat for there's a question from Mark who wanted to know where, what do you consider Maya land, or where the Maya resided or reside?
I think there are two answers. Let me answer first and then pass it to Cristina. I think on a broad context, it's the southern part of Mexico, all of Belize, Guatemala, and then the parts of Honduras and El Salvador. I think the land specifically that Cristina is talking about is, let me pass it over to her to explain a little bit more.
Well, the land that I am talking about and the Maya land claims from the Archaeology and Action Maya people in southern Belize is mostly contained in the Toledo district of southern Belize, the and southernmost district of Belize. It comprises of about 41 Maya villages, and they are in somewhat of a contiguous area in the Toledo district. There's an estimate, we don't know the proportion of land that this will end up being, but certainly a majority of the Toledo district is under use and occupation by these 41 Maya villages now. And just for clarity, the Maya people in Belize, the Kekchi, the Mopan, and the Yucatec, we make up a minority of the population of Belize nationally. However, in southern Belize, the Kekchi and the Mopan are the majority occupants. They are the majority residents in the Toledo district. And so it's no accident or surprise that they also occupy a majority of the land in southern Belize.
Christine, that was actually going to be the next question. Do you have a rough estimate of the population Maya people in the Toledo district?
The last time we tried to estimate that, it is anywhere from 20 to 25,000 Maya Kekchi and Mopan people in these 41 Maya villages.
Thank you. We'll go on to, as the government of Belize supporters development of ancient Maya sites as tourist attractions, so they develop the sites as tourist attractions, how much interaction or cooperation is there with the modern Maya people today? Is there any consultation?
I'm going to leave that one for Cristina. I'd be happy to also add.
You can add. So there's very little interaction in the design, let alone in the implementation or the administration and management of Maya temple sites in particular, or cultural heritage sites. There it is, of course, if you just Google Belize, everything that is put on the tourist attraction sites are the Maya temples. We talk a lot about Maya everything. I mean, even the Pelican Bear has the Maya temple on it, right? Maya Island there, all kinds of enterprises that feature sort of this idea of the Mayan civilization. But the Maya people themselves who continue to live in Belize are very much not a part of even helping to administrate or design those areas, but also not beneficiaries to the revenues that are collected through these tourist attraction sites. Maybe one I want to add to that. It's also important to recognize that for us as Maya people, those sites are not, they're sacred to us. They're not tourist attraction for us. They are our temples. They're where our place of worship and spirituality happens. And so for us, the value placed on those sites are really integral to us being able to define what those mean to us.
I think the only other comment I'll make is that with the Maya land rights moving forward, the question is going to be not whether Maya people should be involved, but in fact, how Maya people and governments will begin a possibly co-management process. But I think that's a conversation that hasn't really moved forward much up till now. It needs to move forward, but I think there's a lot of resistance in government to this.
Excellent. Thank you. We have time for one more question. So that last question is going to be, there was a question about language, Maya language. Is that still, spoken within the communities now? Is it revitalizing?
The Maya language, well, we have 3 groups of Maya in Belize. We have the Yucatec, the Kekchi, and the Mopan Maya. The Yucatec are mostly in the north and the west, and the Kekchi and the Mopan are in southern Belize. And for the Kekchi and the Mopan Maya people, the language is still pretty vibrant. It's spoken in the homes. It's alive. That's not to say that it is not under threat. Clearly, as we engage with the outside, as we become more and more involved, our children more and more in the school systems, there is not Kekchi languages or indigenous languages taught in the schools. In fact, the emphasis is on Spanish and English. And so there is clearly an erosion of those languages in the school system. But what we see is in the North and the West, the Yucatec predominantly lost their language and in fact lost a lot of their culture, including their governance system, their occupation on the land, their practice on the land. But we see actually a resurgence of the Yucatec language among Yucatec people in the North and the West as they begin to organize around cultural revitalization and language becoming a key component in the recovery of their culture. And I think that that is really important to recognize. I think it also speaks volumes to the efforts of the Maya in the South and promoting their rights, their culture, their identity through their land rights struggle has also led to other Maya groups and Indigenous groups in particular to really look at the importance of preservation.
Excellent. Richard or Cristina, do you have any closing thoughts?
Sure. Maybe just to say that, first of all, apologies for all the technical difficulties. This was really a really important topic for us to share and to hear from the audience. It's really important for us as Maya Erchi, even as I join you in this webinar right now. We're constantly living in very contentious times. We're constantly dealing with pressures from the outside. And even as I speak to you right now, there's developments of, major protests, things going on, really to continue to divide and to continue to erode the solidarity and the unity of the Maya people. And I say that because I think it's important then that we recognize the underlying currents that continue to try to erase us and to continue to deny the rights to our identity, to our way of life. And at the center and the core of it all is this struggle against power and control over lands and resources. And that also speaks to why it is that we're not involved in the tourism around these heritage sites. It is because it is about maintaining control. And so I will end there. I want to thank all of you for your kind attention and for your questions.